Okay, so tonight's class is sponsored by Lee Cohen in honor of his aunt Audrey Shalom. So we thank Lee for sponsoring the class. All the weeks of classes sponsored by Neil Tobias in memory of Shafia Batakia, and also my father in honor of my grandfather, Joesph Beyda Alav Shalom. So the topic that we're going to have tonight is a pretty timely one, as I'm getting texts from people that live in the city that they're on curfew and the like. Because we all know that in America in the last week or so, there's been kind of a civil explosion. And what I mean by that is, we all saw the videos of what happened in Minneapolis, where a police officer, actually probably a group of police officers, probably a better way to describe it, were arresting a certain person who probably deserved to be arrested, and they did so in a way that was so forceful and so graphic and so difficult that it really stirred a lot of emotions in the country over an issue that's not a new issue, which is do the police treat black people or minorities fairly, which of course is a question as do minorities get treated fairly in general in the country. These are all issues that have been brought to the forefront in a very visceral way. And, one need just open a newspaper or turn on the television or look on the internet and see how strong the emotions are in all sorts of different ways. And so I thought what would be a good topic for us to talk about tonight is the concept that is called civil disobedience. And I want to explain the term. The concept called civil disobedience where does it fit in Judaism, historically, halacha, so on and so forth. We'll try and touch upon a couple of different areas and ways to talk about this concept, and we'll see what it has to say and what we uncover. But when we say the word civil disobedience, what we mean is to what we'll call to protest a wrong, because a person or a group of people or a large group of people feel that there's some kind of injustice going on. They will go against the rule of the government. They will go against the rule of law, the prevailing way things are in that place, and do something that's not legal. But they're doing it in a way that's well, we'll see what it's about, but they're doing it in a way that is more about protesting an idea, an ideology, or something like that, than it is what you would call a standard crime. Usually, when we look at a crime, we think someone robs a bank to get rich, right? To make the money, right? Someone shoots another person because he doesn't like that person and he wants them dead. But that's not ideological or philosophical. It's different than a situation like, we'll give a couple of examples of civil disobedience. If a large group of people march down the street, in the middle of the street, disrupting traffic, right? That okay? Not, some kind of march of that nature. What about a situation like, let's think, a hunger strike, where someone like Gandhi will sit and not eat food for long periods of time until something is rectified, changed, something along those lines, right? A question that we might have. What about another very famous classic case of civil disobedience? How about if to protest what you deem as an unfair government or tax, you unload large crates of merchandise and destroy them, right? Of course, I'm talking about the Boston Tea Party, right? In I think 1770, forget the year. I don't think it's 76, but whatever it is, American patriots, something that we celebrate, right? Took cartons and cartons of tea that belonged to East India Trading Company, which basically is England, and threw it, destroyed it by throwing it into the water in order to protest taxation without representation, a particular type of tax that they deemed unfair. How do we feel about these things? Are these things permissible or not? And again, obviously, it goes into today's times where we're seeing a couple of different things. Number one, we're seeing large groups of people get together in the street, certainly in defiance of social distancing, right? These are not, these are large gatherings of people, which are not okay, and without making too political a statement, right? But just 2-3 weeks ago, it seems, or maybe it was a month ago, the mayor was very upset at certain funerals that had 2,000-3,000 people. But these protests have much more than that, so it's in defiance of the law and the way things are. So that's number one. And number two, one of the things that we're seeing is there's an extensive amount of property damage being caused: graffiti, broken glass, looting, and even in some instances, hurting people, whether it be police officers or store owners or things of that nature. So what do we have to say about this? Is this something that's acceptable to us? And as Jews, what do we think? Now, what I want to do is kind of go through as many sources as possible that talk about this topic to try and, I can't say I'm going to create an all-inclusive idea, but to certainly put something out there. And before we dismiss any of the things that we just said, I want to throw one more classic case that could certainly be a question. Right? Not so long ago, about 15 years ago, under Ariel Sharon, the Israeli government decided to uproot settlements from the Gaza Strip. You may remember it. And people were not so happy about it, especially the people that live there. But not only the people that live there, a lot of people who didn't live there went to plant themselves there and hold themselves, to squat in public places in that town, or to tie themselves to the roof of a building and something of that nature. So is that okay? Is that permissible? Is it okay according to halacha? What do we feel about that? Those are all the types of questions that I want to throw out, and see what we can get to as we do this. Okay. So let me ask you: can you think of any examples of civil disobedience? And again, civil disobedience means to defy the rule of law in order to make a particular purpose. There's not defying the rule of law for your own benefit, right? So that you can put money in your pocket or avoid paying taxes or something like that, but rather for some ideological moral belief or some form of protest against the way the government is handling things. Can you think of examples in the Torah, in the Navi, in Jewish history that fit into this category? So I'm going to turn that out to you. What examples can you think of?
The establishment of the State of Israel. Menachem Begin was involved with civil disobedience against the British, including bombing the King David Hotel,
right.
which killed, I forget how many people.
Right. So there was certainly another example of people against the government and Jewish people. So certainly recent, or relatively recent, in the last 80 years. Menachem Begin was part of an organization that was branded a terrorist organization. And I'm not sure we would disagree with that branding of that organization, because they did do what we would call acts of terror against the British government, the mandate of the people at the time, and also against part of the Arab population that was there. So certainly a question, definitely something that could be a possibility, but not something that I would say that we would use as a proof of what's acceptable or not acceptable, because it's too recent. It's hard to say that's what we would say is our basis. So what else do we have?
The Maccabees.
What about the Yaakov's children that killed all the people of the town? Was it Shimon, Reuven, Shimon?
Okay, so first of all, let's go back to both of those. So the Maccabees is an interesting one. The Maccabees is not civil disobedience; that's a war, right? And I'm going to say the same thing about Yaakov. right? To fight a war isn't civil disobedience, right? To fight a war is to say, I revolt and I rebel against what's happening here. That's not civil disobedience, that's a war, right? Civil disobedience is, listen, I'm not keeping one rule or a set of the rules in order to make a point that either that rule or some aspect of the rules is unfair, right? So it's not a war, right? To revolt is not civil disobedience. It's a different level, and we could certainly talk about revolts, right? You had Bar Kokhba and other things, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I really wanted to talk about was cases where someone says, I'm not going to follow the law. The government said do this, and I'm not going to do this. Now, of course, remember, we know the very important Jewish principle, which is Dina de Malchuta Dina, which is the law of the land is the law, right? When the government says something, in general, we say we follow the law. In fact, the first time Jews go from being no longer in the land of Israel to outside the land of Israel, none less than the prophet Yirmiyahu turns to the people and he says, listen, get comfortable where you're at and respect the government that's there. Respect the place that you live in, because having peace and welfare in whatever place you're going to live in is what's best for you. So in general, Jews have been very good citizens, as evidenced by what Yirmiyahu told them to do. And Dina de Malchuta Dina, you know, I don't want to play it for you, but someone sent me something from Jackie Mason, which I guess must be a while ago, right? And he, of course, Jackie Mason is a comedian, and okay, we could talk about whether or not some of what he says here is racially insensitive or not. But he says, basically, he says, you know, you have to be careful, you know, that the mayor said you have to be, at a different time he's saying this, you have to be careful about how you treat a certain group of people at the end of the summer because they haven't been working, and if they haven't been working, they're going to be unhappy and they're going to riot and they're going to destroy things and they're going to break things, much like what we're seeing today. So he says, can you imagine them saying that about the Jews? Right? Oh, at the end of yeshiva break, you got to be careful about how you talk to those boys in the taler and the tefillin. You know, if they hear that you know, if you don't treat them the right way, well, then you better watch out. Then they're going to go destroying and looting and so on, right? You don't think that about Jewish people, right? Jews, for the most part, we've always thought of them as being good citizens in the societies that they were in, even if the societies that they were in weren't so great. Certainly in America, Jews have been good citizens. But even go not to America, go somewhere else. Go to Iran, go to Iraq, go to Syria, go to Germany. Jews have always been good citizens wherever they've been, for the most part. So the question is, are there situations where they have not? And I want to go back as far as possible to find some original cases of Jews not obeying the law, or some other examples of somebody not obeying the law, and see if we can learn anything from it. So what's the earliest? Well, we'll talk about Eliyahu Navi. Might be something. What's the earliest example of what we would call civil disobedience? The first time we see somebody says, I know that's the law of the government, I'm not following that law. All right, what's the first example? You all know it. You're just not thinking of it as an example.
Can it be the children of Yaakov when they killed the whole town because of...
So again, I want to take that killing and violence, I'm going to say is already beyond, and it's like a war, right? You know, that's a retaliation, and I don't even know that that's necessarily that those people were the government for Yaakov. You know, like those are like two nations, one against the other. Abraham against Sodom or something like that. That's not civil disobedience. I'm talking about someone who's a citizen in a society saying, I'm not going to follow that rule. That rule doesn't, we're not going to follow that rule. We're going to go against the ruler, the king, the government, or something like that. So I'm going to give you the first, about what I could think of known example, is right in the beginning of the book of Shemot, is Shifra and Pu'ah, right? We all know them, right? Shifra and Pu'ah, they are the midwives. Right? And what's the rule? The rule is kill the babies, right? That's what Paro says. Kill all the babies of the Hebrews, right? And these two midwives, Shifra and Pu'ah, who it's very interesting, who are Shifra and Pu'ah? So there's a lot of debate amongst the commentaries as to whether or not Shifra and Pu'ah are Jews, and some people say it's Yocheved and Miriam, or maybe they're non-Jews, right? That really changes the story a lot, right? Because if they're non-Jews, so then if they're Jews, why don't they kill the babies? Because they say those are our people, right? And it's kind of almost like a defensive measure, right? But if you say they're non-Jews, right? If you say the midwives are Egyptians who worked for the Jews, right? So now that's a very different story. And actually, you may have the first recorded example, possibly in history, of what we'll call civil disobedience, where these two people say, hey, that's wrong. That's not the right way to do something. Even though the king says, this is what I should do, I am not going to follow that rule. It's unethical. It's immoral. I'm going to stand on principle, and I'm going to not follow the rule, right? And the Torah looks at these two people very positively, right? And rewards them for the actions that they take. So here is the first example, I would say, of civil disobedience, and it's a very good example. And it basically says, sometimes it's appropriate. So we'll come back to it, but that's the first example that I could think of. I'm open to other thoughts, but that's the first example that I could think of an example of civil disobedience. Let's talk about some others. You may remember that Moshe Rabbeinu sends Yehoshua, Moshe Rabbeinu's successor, right at the beginning of his book, before he conquers Jericho, in chapter 2 of the book of Joshua and the book of Joshua, what does he do? He sends 2 spies into the town of Jericho. And they hide out in the house of Rachav Hazonah, and the government comes looking for them. And the government says, Rachav, give us these 2 guys. And she says they went that way, right? She doesn't give them away. She protects them against the government. But potentially, that's also an act of civil disobedience. She thinks that the government of Yericho is not doing things the right way, and she's going to go on the other side. So that's possible. It's possible. It's a different version of it, but definitely something that's possible. I'll give you another example. Another example comes from the book of Shemuel. In the book of Shemuel, what happens? David HaMelech is a threat to Shaul the king. Shaul is the king, but he's very worried about David HaMelech. And he's concerned, David's not yet the Melech, but he's going to one day be the king. And Shaul is very worried about him, even though it's his son-in-law. He's forced to run away, David. David runs away, and he runs to a city called Nov, which is a city of Kohanim. And those guys don't even know that David is wanted by Shaul. So they give him food and shelter and even weapons because they assume he's a good guy. They don't know that he's a fugitive from Shaul. And then they run away. Shaul finds out, comes to the city, and lines up all the Kohanim and turns to his military people, and he says, kill all these Kohanim. Right? He tells his soldiers, Shaul tells the soldiers, show of might, these guys helped David, I want them all dead. And the Tanakh tells us that the soldiers refused. The soldiers would not kill these Kohanim in defiance of the order of the king. Very interesting. Another case of a civil disobedience where we don't follow. Some other examples, right? Very well known. Right? Mordechai will not bow down to Haman, right? Even though that's the time and the place. I think my dad said Eliyahu Hanavi. So Eliyahu Hanavi is interesting. He causes the rain to stop. He damages the economy of the whole Israel in order to show that Hashem is right and that the people are wrong. In addition to that, at his time, there's somebody else that is even, I would call him more of a classic civil disobedience, and that is Ovadiah. There's somebody named Ovadiah who is actually the chief of staff of the king Achav, who's a very evil king, a Jewish king, but an evil one. And that evil king had sought to kill all of the Nevi'im, all the good prophets. He wanted to kill them. So his chief of staff, Ovadiah, meaning his right-hand man, what does he do? He takes all the prophets and he hides them in a cave and he provides them with food and he protects them Again, another version of going against the government, going against the king from inside. Interestingly enough, here it was it was a governmental person. Someone mentioned the Maccabees. So the Maccabees, you might argue it's a war, it's an insurrection, it's a revolution, so maybe that doesn't count. But in the book of Maccabees, there's a very famous story that's told of Hannah and her 7 children. And the 7 children are told, eat this unkosher food or we will kill you. And they go against it and they say, we will not eat the unkosher food. And they do, they become martyrs. It's an interesting case. There's another case I'd love to read for you. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to pull it up. I have it on my computer. This comes from the book of, one of Josephus's books called The Antiquities of the Jews. And he's describing a situation where the Roman Emperor Caligula decided to place a statue of himself in the Bet HaMikdash. And he appoints a general named Petronius to be his agent. And Petronius was given a large army in order to make sure that he got this done. But Petronius was told, listen, try and talk to the Jews, and so let's try and do this peacefully without too much bloodshed. Let's see if you talk to them, if you could get them to do it. He says, if the Jews don't do it, then you're going to use your army. So Petronius gets an army of Romans. You know, he's going to speak softly and carry a big stick. So he brings an army of Romans, and they meet up with the Jews at a town that we know today as Akko. In Akko, what happens? So this is what Josephus writes. He says, there came 10,000 Jews to Petronius at Akko to offer their petitions to him that he would not compel them to violate the law of their forefathers. But if they said, you are wholly resolved to bring the statue and install it, then you must first kill us, and then do what you have resolved on. For while we are alive, we cannot permit such things as are forbidden by our law and by the determination of our forefathers, that such prohibitions are examples of virtue. They threw themselves down on their faces and stretched out their throats and said they were ready to be killed. Right, almost like it's a protest. You know, they're sitting there and saying, "Kill us! You're going to have to kill us in order to do this." So it's pretty fascinating to me that you have a lot of examples over the course of history of Jews in different circumstances saying, "Hey, that's not a just rule. We're not going to follow it." Now, the truth is, most of what I talked about involved what we call Kiddush Hashem, right? And Kiddush Hashem is a certain area of halacha, which says that if someone, even forcibly, wants you to violate one of 3, what we'll call cardinal sins, avodah zarah, gilui arayot, or shfichut damim, idolatry, incest, or murder, then you say, you can kill me, I am not going to violate that sin. Most of the cases that we talked about here are situations like that, but not all. And so it's a question as to what if that's not the case? What if it's not a law of murder or incest or idolatry? What if it's a smaller thing, right? Like, for example, what if they told us you can't do Brit Milah, right? And this actually, is a real case, right? What if they said you can't do Brit Milah? You're not allowed. Right? So do we follow that rule? And the answer is halachically and historically, we don't follow the rule. We find a way to do it. So we violate the law. We break the law of the land, and we go against it. And we do everything that we can to not go against it. But if we can't get them to change the law for the better, then we find a way to do it in hiding, to bribe people off, to let us do it, or things of that nature in order to make it work. Some other cases of where the concept of protest is very much built into our way of doing things, right? So the most classic example of a protest is the example of Abraham Avinu, right? Abraham Avinu, when Hashem tells him he's going to destroy Sodom, Abraham tells Hashem, he says, "You can't do that. I protest," and he kind of gets in the way of the decision. In the end, he accedes and he says, it's okay, if you say so, Hashem, I'll let you do it. But he really acts very much like a protester, as does Moshe Rabbeinu when it comes to Chet HaEgel and other sins in the Torah, where Hashem is interested in destroying the people, Moshe Rabbeinu kind of gets in the way and says, hey, you can't do that. So I think there's examples of that. Let me quote you another Gemara. Give me 1 second. I'm quoting from Masechet Shabbat. Hold on. Hold on. Sorry, I have to find it on my sheet here. Okay, it says like this. I think this is it. Hold on. It says like this. Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan say, whoever can protest to his household and does not is accountable for their sins. If he could protest to his townspeople and he does not, he is accountable for their sins. If he could protest to the whole world and he does not, he's accountable for the whole world. Basically, what that midrash is saying is if we see that there's going to be people in our family most immediately, but then it extends to my town and to my world, if I see that they're going to act sinfully, wrongfully, and not necessarily only in murder, avodah zarah, and gilui arayot, if I see that they are sinning and I don't stop them, I have to protest. I have to say, hey, that's not right. That's not okay. So the concept of protesting a wrong does have some source in it. In fact, I'm going to quote to you from the Maharal of Prague. 1 second. He says like this. I'm translating. While a person may be individually pious, such good will pale in the face of the sin of not protesting against an emerging communal evil. Such a pious person will be accountable for having been able to prevent it and not. According to the Maharal of Prague, you could be super righteous. You are you're wearing the largest size talit, and you pray Netz Minyan, and you give a lot of tzedakah, and you won't speak Lashon Hara, and you keep Shabbat to the fullest. Right? You're a righteous person. But if you have the opportunity to stand up against a wrong in your neighborhood, and you don't stand up against it, then you're held accountable. And he says that all the good things that you do pale in comparison to not standing up for something and saying, hey, that's not acceptable. That's not right. I don't accept that. It's a very strong statement. But I'm going to quote you an even stronger statement of the Orchot Tzadikim, who says the following. He says, if one could protest, but doesn't protest or pay attention to when people are doing the wrong thing, it's what's called flattery, because the sinners think, since you didn't say anything, you're okay with this, right? In other words, if people see that we don't say something wrong is wrong, we don't call out a wrong, then the assumption is that we've accepted that wrong as acceptable, and we've sent a message to the people who are committing it as it's acceptable, and that's problematic. And therefore, we're not allowed to do that. So what we've seen tonight is actually that there are many instances where we will say, you have to stand up for the right thing. You have to protest if you have the ability to protest. Now, what does it mean that I have the ability to protest? It's a slippery slope and it's pretty tricky. But basically, I would say the following things. Vandalism is not allowed. So I would say the Boston Tea Party was unacceptable, right? And according to Halacha, the Boston Tea Party was inappropriate. I know we teach it and we celebrate it and so on, but destroying that property is looked at the same way as bashing in the front window of Macy's or a lot of the other things that are doing. Of course, we can't hurt people, but can we do things like stage a sit-in? Can we create minor disruptions to, perhaps traffic patterns or things like that? it seems like it's possible. And I would go as far to say as, what if I would get arrested, right? What if there would be a situation where I would get arrested for doing a sit-in? I didn't harm anyone, but the police said, you need to leave or we're going to arrest you, right? Must I leave or can I be arrested? And actually, the answer is probably you can be arrested for the right cause, right? So let's say we were, early this spring, there was a protest against or a unity rally against anti-Semitism. So let's say we felt, right, that happened to be all in a great, the police said it's okay and there was no issue, but basically we closed the Brooklyn Bridge, right? Let's say we did this and we didn't ask the police because the police weren't letting us, and as a result, we got arrested. But we made a point that, hey, you got to take care of the Jewish people. It's possible that we would say that is not, if we're willing to sit in the jail cell for the night or 2 nights or so on and so forth, then there are things that are worth it. There are things that we need to make a statement about. Baruch Hashem, I don't feel that there's anything that fits that for us today, but it could be that there are situations that there would be things like that. So, there were certainly rabbis who felt that way about the disengagement in Gaza. Right? There were many rabbis who said that the protesters there had a right to sit in a place that and chain themselves to a fence or a wall or something like that in order to protest against that. There were rabbis that did similar type stuff, to protest nuclear weapons because they felt that nuclear weapons were a major damage, a major danger to our world and our existence as we know it. And so potentially that might be something. We'd have to ask ourselves, what's the right cause, right? But let's say, Bill de Blasio came out and said, no one can do a Brit Milah in New York City, right? I decided it's a health risk, right? And therefore I'm opposed to doing a Brit Milah. It's not out of the realm to create a situation in which we'd have a protest, and the protest shouldn't be violent, but would not necessarily have to follow every rule of the state that we live in, because we were trying to stand up for something very significant. And as we said, we might do the Brit Milah anyway. Thank you, Mayor de Blasio, but we're going to do it. So thankfully, we don't have that problem. But there are places that do have that problem. I forget which Scandinavian country had outlawed Brit Milah. I don't remember if it was Sweden, Denmark, Finland, something like that. One of them outlawed Brit Milah. It's a major issue in that place.
San Francisco tried to a few years ago.
Yeah, it's not out of the realm. It's not crazy, and New York, I don't remember how they handled the Mitzitza B'Peh. It was a whole back and forth. I think today they're not so on top of it. But for a while they were cracking down on a certain part of the Brit Milah. And so who's to say that they couldn't have said the whole thing is no good? And the way things work today, anything's possible. So
we had all the demonstrations for Soviet Jewry,
right?
Where they were definitely not all within the context of the law. The demonstrators,
sure.
They didn't try to break the law, but they protested. They marched in places they weren't allowed to march.
Right.
And
no question.
Every rabbi in the city was, well, not everybody, but many rabbis were involved in it.
Right. So there's no question that there are circumstances or there are times that we would do that. So I don't particularly feel that that's the right thing to do today, especially given the nature of a number of different things that are going on today, and the heavy level of looting and the lack of general direction of what's going on. I don't know that that's right, but the truth is, we're not okay with police officers abusing people. I don't know that. I want to be careful when I say that because the overwhelming, it's my belief, the overwhelming majority of police officers are very good and very fair people and don't do things like this. But someone might counter argument and say, easy for you to say, you're a white Jewish guy, and would you be a black guy? You may not feel the same way. And, right or wrong, I could tell you a lot of African Americans do not feel they get treated fairly by the police as a general policy, which, that can't be, that's not okay. That's it has to be, that you get judged based on your actions and what you do, not the color of your skin. So, or your religion or whatever else, that we don't want that, and I think as Jews, we know that, if it's not a just and fair society for all, we're going to end up being on the short end of the stick. Even if at a particular moment we're not there, overall we'll end up there, because when there's discrimination and there's hatred, it has always come back to us, and we don't want that. So I'm not telling you whether you should post a black square on your Instagram or go out and make a demonstration in Times Square after curfew. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that history and the Torah and the halacha and so on show us that sometimes in certain situations, under the right circumstances and with the right way of behaving, making a statement by not keeping a particular law of the prevailing government is acceptable and maybe even the right thing to do, even though generally that's not the case, and generally we want to follow the rule of the land, because we wherever we are, and especially in good places like America and Israel and Canada and so on, we respect our government greatly. But given that protests are part of the United States of America, and rallies and things like that, we want to do them peacefully and in coordination with the police and with the authorities and so on as best we can. But there could be circumstances where that's not, and we have to recognize that and accept that, and that's something that goes back all the way back to our very beginnings as a people, as sometimes there's a time and place for that. So something to think about. Not easy, but yep. I'm gonna stop here. Anyone feel free to throw any questions out or thoughts. Hope I didn't offend anybody too much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very good subject, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so tonight's class, again, we said it at the beginning, but we'll say it at the end also, sponsored by Lee Cohen in honor of his Aunt Audrey, and all the classes this week by Neil Tobias and Ted Beyda. Thank you very much. Leilui Nishmat, Shafia Batzakia, and also Joesph R. Beyda. Alav Shalom. Okay. Have a good night, everybody.
You too.
Good
Be
night.
well.
Stay safe.
You too.